We are finally here, fellas. It is the fantasy football playoffs. I'm sure you guys are excited as I am. So today I figured I'd bring you like an exciting type of video. 10 players that are scorching hot entering the fantasy football playoffs. I'm sure you're going to want to know if these guys are on your fantasy football teams, ready to help you hoist that fantasy football trophy. So if you guys are excited for the fantasy football playoffs, leave me a like down below. Subscribe to the channel if you are new around here. You're going to want to keep it tapped in with everything that we got going on over here, from fantasy football playoff content to dynasty content as soon as the season is over. You're going to want to keep it right here. So with that being said, let's get into it. All right, so we're going to get it kicked off with a former fantasy football MVP, Cooper Kupp, wide receiver of the Los Angeles Rams. Recently, I've made updates to my rest of season rankings, and of course, you can get those on Flock Fantasy. I'm actually going to be doing a rest of season rankings tier list by position on Wednesday. I'll go through all my top, quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, tight ends, and streaming defenses on Wednesday, so stay tuned for that video. But Cooper Kupp moved from my wide receiver 19 heading into this week to my wide receiver 13 now. Welcome back, because 16 PPR points last week and 26 PPR points in week 14. The last two games, Matthew Stafford is dealing right now. He's playing at a borderline MVP level. He's not going to get the MVP, obviously, but against one of the best defenses in the league in the Baltimore Ravens, Cooper Kupp absolutely shredded them, and he looked healthy for the first time all season. The Rams are fighting for a playoff spot the rest of the way, and Cooper Kupp has two top 12 matchups during the fantasy football playoffs against Washington and against the Giants. The only other matchup that they have during the playoffs is against the Saints, and they're a beatable defense, a beatable team in general. The 2021 Cooper Kupp is definitely not walking down that tunnel in SoFi Stadium, but if you manage to tread water with Cooper Kupp, maybe you traded low for him or whatever, while Kupp figured out his health and figured out his shit, he might actually really, really reward you going in to the fantasy football playoffs and potentially win you a fantasy championship. So you got to be excited if you have Cooper Kupp right now. He's saving his best for last, it appears. Ezekiel Elliott turning back the clock, definitely looking more like a 2020 version of Ezekiel Elliott. Running back 28, my rankings heading into this week. Running back 21 in my rest of season rankings now. Zeke Elliott going for 140 yards and a touchdown in his first game back as the starter for the Patriots now was not on my bingo card. 30 opportunities and 8 targets for Ezekiel Elliott. If there's one thing that we know about him, it's that he can carry a workload. He is able to handle any amount of carry volume and reception volume that you can put on his plate, and he has two top 10 matchups in Week 16 and Week 17 against the Denver Broncos and the Buffalo Bills, especially if you guys earned a bye. Heading into your fantasy football playoffs, you can skip this week's matchup against the Kansas City Chiefs. He's got fresh legs. He can carry a big workload. This is a team that probably wants to just run the ball as much as they possibly can, get this season over with, and quarterbacks who can't throw for more than 5+ yards downfield. I would not be shocked if the rest of the season, in every single game, Ezekiel Elliott has 20+ opportunities, and that's going to make him a legitimate RB2 option that could end up being a league winner. We saw this a couple years ago with Sony Michel getting big workload at the end of the year. We saw this with Tyler Algier last year, with Rashad Penny a couple years ago, Darrell Williams a couple years ago. Buckle up, folks, because Ezekiel Elliott might legitimately win some people some leagues, and I think he's an every week starter going forward. Rachaad White, my running back 11 coming into the week in my rest of season rankings, now my running back 6 in my rest of season rankings. Back in week 6 with Rachaad White after a rough loss to the Detroit Lions, we put out a trade targets video, and Rachaad White was on the thumbnail of that video. And I touted Rachaad White as a guy that is simply getting too good of a workload to continue being like the RB3 that he had been to that point in the season. He was performing as this guy that was getting a workload, but he's extremely inefficient. And since that game, Rachaad White has been a top 18 running back in every single game, including 4 top 10 finishes on the season. 5 games over 20 opportunities. White is set up perfectly to keep this going for the rest of the season. He's playing at a much higher level. The Bucs are in the hunt for a playoff spot. They're currently leading their division, and the Packers, Jags, and Saints rest of season ranked 6th, 9th, and 12th against fantasy running backs over the last 5 weeks. So he has some exploitable matchups, and of course, his workload is borderline untouchable right now. The target volume that he's getting, the carry volume that he's getting, he has a monopoly on the goal line. He's able to break off big plays. Really impressed with what I've seen from Rachaad White, both as a Bucs fan, because I didn't think he was very good coming into the season, and also as a fantasy performer, he has been very, very solid as well. So DJ Moore, another guy that I am really excited about heading into the fantasy playoffs. He's been scorching hot as of late. Wide receiver 16 in my rest of season rankings prior to this week. Wide receiver 12 now in my rest of season rankings. DJ Moore is tied with the likes of Stephon Diggs, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jamar Chase, Deebo Samuel, and Michael Pittman Jr. for the third most games of over 20-plus PPR points among wide receivers with 5. All of those guys have 5. A.J. Brown, CeeDee Lamb, Puka Nacua, and Keenan Allen have 6. And then, of course, Tyreek Hill is an absolute freak of nature, and he has 9 games of 20-plus PPR points. But I think the interesting thing with DJ Moore is we know he's given you those high ceiling games, and there's actually something that is really projectable going forward about those high ceiling games, because all 5 of those games, ironically, have come the last 5 healthy games that Justin Fields has both started and finished. The last 3 games in a row, week 11, week 12, and week 14, and then all the way back to the midpoint of the season, week 4 and week 5, he had those monster games. In week 6, Justin Fields gets hurt against the Minnesota Vikings, and then DJ Moore is kind of pedestrian with Tyson Bagent on the field. All those games had Justin Fields involved, playing a full allotment of snaps. These two were just heating up prior to that injury to Justin Fields. So with DJ Moore, I'm very, very ecstatic to see what he can do down the stretch of the rest of the season, and they have a potential, mini sneaky shootout in week 17 against the Atlanta Falcons that I'm really excited for as well. So with DJ Moore, he is saving his best for last as well, and hopefully Justin Fields and him can stay on track and stay healthy for the rest of the year. Michael Pittman Jr., wide receiver 14 coming into the week for me in my rest of season rankings, now wide receiver 10. 6 of his last 8 games, Michael Pittman Jr. has double-digit targets, including a number of games with like 13, 14, 15 targets. The Colts are fighting for a playoff spot along with a lot of teams in the AFC right now. They are 7-6, and they've been running this like up-tempo, Pittman-centric pass attack all year, but it's really been bearing fruit since Gardner Minshew took over the starting job. He has been a bona fide wide receiver 1 in fantasy. Like I said, 6 of his last 8 games, he has commanded double-digit targets, and the Steelers, Falcons, and Raiders rest of the season, none of those defenses really scare me, although the Falcons have been solid all year, and the Steelers are a decent pass rush. I think the Colts are able to move the ball against those teams. And more importantly, Michael Pittman Jr. is able to put up fantasy production against all of those teams as well. So very excited about Pittman going forward. I am a believer. I think this guy is a wide receiver 1 for the rest of the year. Brock Purdy, the only quarterback of this video, one guy that has been absolutely scorching hot lately as well. Quarterback 9 in my rest of season rankings coming into the week. Now my quarterback 5. I moved him above Patrick Mahomes, above Justin Herbert, who obviously got injured, above, the likes of Justin Fields and Kyler Murray. He has 2 or more passing touchdowns in 8 games this year. He has 9 games over 250 plus passing yards. This guy has a passing floor that is comparable to some of the best quarterback seasons we've seen over the last 5 years. From a fantasy quarterback. He is quarterback 5 in points per game right now. And yeah, he's getting carried by the 49ers weapons, Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, George Kittle, and Christian McCaffrey, but he is still playing at an MVP level himself. Arizona has the 7th most adjusted fantasy points allowed to the quarterback position. That is his week 15 opponent. In the championship week, when it matters most, he has the 2nd easiest pass defense in the NFL in the Washington Commanders. In week 16, a little bit of a tougher matchup against the Baltimore Ravens, but it should be a high-scoring game. Both current active number 1 seeds in the AFC and the NFC respectively. I expect that game to have a lot of points. So with Brock Purdy, there's not one game the rest of the year that really scares me off of starting this guy and potentially starting him over the likes of Patrick Mahomes, over the likes of Kyler Murray, over Justin Fields and CJ Stroud and Tua Tagovailoa and all those types of guys that you might think you should start over Brock Purdy. I'm telling you, you should roll with Brock Purdy instead. So Breece Hall, another guy on this list here, running back 13 for me coming into the week, running back 9 for me rest of the season now, 5 or more receptions in 6 of his last 8 games, and 6 or more targets in 4 straight games. So with Breece Hall, you're getting the early down work, you're getting the goal line work, which there hasn't been a lot of this year, but more importantly, what's been buoying his fantasy production is the receiving work. Zach Wilson had his best game of his career this past week. I'm not sure that that will continue because I don't think Zach Wilson is a good quarterback, but it is really nice knowing that Miami, Washington, and Cleveland, minus Cleveland at the end of the season, are 2 of his next 3 games that he can actually move the ball on offense, and Breece Hall can get the job done on the ground. Cleveland has actually been about league average against the run as well, so even that Cleveland game, if Zach Wilson struggles, Breece Hall should be able to get it done on the ground. It's not quite as daunting of a matchup over the last 5 weeks as it's been most of the year, and over 60% of the Jets snaps is what Breece Hall has played in 8 straight games. Since that comment that Robert Saleh made back in early on in the season where he said the training wheels are off and he's back fully healthy, he has been clearly the Jets' bell cow since then, and honestly, he's probably due to break off one of those patented long touchdowns that Breece Hall has been doing over the course of the season but hasn't done in a number of weeks. He hasn't had one of those long touchdowns in about 6 games, so I think that Breece Hall, knowing that he has the big play upside, the receiving upside, a great workload, the upside that if they ever do get into the red zone, he's going to be the one getting the ball. I'm really excited about what he can do for the rest of the season. I'm absolutely trusting him as a top 10 running back over the likes of even like Derrick Henry or DeAndre Swift or Austin Eckler, who have had a little bit more up and down performance as of late. So Deebo Samuel, the next guy that has been scorching hot entering the fantasy playoffs, and especially the last couple weeks, Deebo Samuel goes from my wide receiver 22 down to my wide receiver 14. Deebo Samuel, like DJ Moore and Michael Pittman, as I mentioned earlier, has 5+ games of 20+ PPR points. He has a lower floor than those guys. He has not quite been as consistent from a target share standpoint, but the way that Brock Purdy and the 49ers offense is playing together, I'd be hard-pressed not to expect Deebo Samuel to absolutely sunrun the rest of the season, have another monster game or another multiple monster games. Deebo Samuel has not looked this explosive since 2021 when he was a top 5 fantasy wide receiver and averaged over 20+ points per game. I think that confidence level, that ability to break off these long plays is coming from the fact that he's actually healthy and the fact that the 49ers offense is presenting so many matchup disadvantages for defenses that Deebo Samuel is now getting his. For a while, it was Ayuk getting his, it was Kittle getting his, Christian McCaffrey's been consistent all year. If you have Deebo Samuel, he could absolutely carry you to a fantasy title with 2 of his last 3 games against the Cardinals this week and the Commanders in the fantasy championship. As I talked about for Purdy already, that week 16 game against Baltimore is a little bit tougher, but I'd be hard pressed to see anybody slow this 49ers offense down, let alone any of those defenses that I mentioned. So Tony Pollard, the second last guy that we're going to talk about in this video, running back 9 for me entering the week in my rest of season rankings. He is now my running back 4 in my rest of season rankings, and the reason is he's had 17 PPR points or more in 4 straight games for Tony Pollard. So he's gotten back on track. He looks more like the Tony Pollard of old. 8, 4, 6, and 5 targets the last 4 games has really helped buoy his fantasy production and get him back in the good graces of our fantasy teams. 3 shootouts to close out the season. That is why I love Tony Pollard for the rest of the year, because the Cowboys, they travel to Buffalo this week to play against the Buffalo Bills. I'm going to be actually at that game. I'm going to be in attendance for that one. I'm really excited for that game, and we'll have streams and all that good stuff later on in the week. Week 16 at Miami. Again, another high-scoring game environment. Probably another 50+ point over-under game there. And then week 17, home versus Detroit, which we know the Dallas Cowboys have played very well at home this year, undefeated at home, scoring over 40 points per game at home as well. So very excited for that game as well. It's so hard to imagine myself, given all these game environments and all the positive matchups here, ranking Tony Pollard outside of my top 5 running backs in either week 15, week 16, or week 17. And that makes him a top 5 running back for me for the rest of the year, and potentially even like my RB2 or 3 for the rest of the year if you wanted to argue him over the likes of like ETN, Bijan, depending on what happens tonight, over like an Achane or something like that. And also all of these 3 defenses are semi-easy matchups for fantasy running backs. So good chance that Tony Pollard could end up being a league winner down the stretch. David Njoku, the only tight end of this video, tight end 7 for me entering the week. Now tight end 5, I moved him above Trey McBride and above Dalton Kincaid for the rest of the season. Every game since week 7, David Njoku has commanded at least 6 targets. He has been very consistent as far as his target share is concerned. He had a blow-up performance this past week with 2 touchdowns. That'll help boost his confidence going forward. But here's the thing. Joe Flacco is all-encompassing. They finally have a guy who can just sit back behind the elite Cleveland Browns offensive line and just deal the ball to Amari Cooper, to Elijah Moore, and David Njoku. And we've seen that bear fruit in recent weeks for all of those players. You can absolutely trust this to continue, in my opinion, because the Browns also pushing for a playoff spot. They're currently the 5 seed in the AFC. Chicago and Houston, the next 2 games, they're very easy matchups for the passing game. The New York Jets in week 17, tougher matchup for the wide receiver position, but they can be exploited by a tight end like David Njoku. So for David Njoku, he's got a great matchup for the rest of the year, and he's playing at a high level, getting the targets, making explosive plays. So if you have David Njoku as your starting tight end, feel pretty good about it because he has a chance to really win some people some leagues down the stretch. So if you guys enjoyed this video, a little bit more of a fun video, not a whole lot of like actionable advice here, but if you did enjoy it, leave a like down below, subscribe to the channel if you are new around here. I am ecstatic that we have the fantasy playoffs on deck. I'm excited to help you guys win some fantasy football championships, win some rings, win some belts, whatever you guys got to bring home for your fantasy title. We are excited to help you get there. So with that being said, peace out, and we'll talk to you soon.